On a dark and stormy night over the Pacific Ocean, a mighty Boeing 747 is climbing steadily up towards its cruising altitude, with over 300 passengers on board. It's almost 2 o'clock in the morning, so the lights are dimmed down and many passengers have settled into their seats with blankets and pillows, comforted by the steady roar of the engines outside. Nearby, flashes of lightning illuminate the ocean under a storm cell, so the pilots soon request a slight deviation to keep clear of this weather. And as the Boeing 747 is climbing through 20,000 feet, the captain decides to keep the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated in case they would encounter some turbulence from those storms. Suddenly, the quiet of the night is interrupted by a loud metallic clunk, coming from somewhere beneath the passenger cabin. The captain has just enough time to ask, "What the hell was that?" and the flight engineer to reply, "I don't know," before the plane is rocked by a massive bone-shattering explosion. Twisted metal now flies in all different directions, and the air suddenly starts rushing out of the cabin, ripping through the aisles like a hurricane, taking everything with it that isn't nailed down. In the cockpit, the captain now remembers his colleagues at Pan Am, who just 2 months before had plunged into the town of Lockerbie in Scotland at the hands of a terrorist bomb. And for a few horrible seconds, he thinks that the same thing has now happened to him. Now, for most of the passengers, this trip on the 23rd of February 1989 had started thousands of miles away in Los Angeles, where they had boarded United Airlines Flight 811, an overnight flight to Sydney, Australia, with en route stops in Honolulu, Hawaii and Auckland, New Zealand. The nearly 19-year-old Boeing 747-100 that was being used had rolled off the assembly line in 1970 as part of the first generation of Boeing's iconic jumbo jet. And by this time, it had accumulated 58,800 operating hours across over 15,000, mostly long-haul flights. Now, this airplane had various minor technical defects recorded on it, like you would expect from a plane that had been in service for that long. But all of those snags were either fixed or deferred in accordance with the minimum equipment list, so the crew had encountered no problems in flying the jet over towards Honolulu. So just after midnight local time on the 24th of February, Flight 811 then landed uneventfully in Hawaii, where some passengers disembarked and others boarded, bringing the total passenger count for the next leg up to 337, plus 3 flight crew and 15 cabin crew. The flight crew, who was now about to take over for the leg over to Auckland, had been off duty in Honolulu for 34 hours and were therefore feeling well rested, despite their red-eye departure time of 01:30 in the morning. In command of the coming flight was a 59-year-old captain, who was at this point getting very close to retirement after a long career spanning 28,000 flying hours, of which more than 1,600 had been spent on the Boeing 747. His first officer was 48 years old and was also quite experienced with 14,500 total hours, although just 300 of those had been operated on the 747. Finally, the flight crew also included a 46-year-old flight engineer with about 20,000 total hours, including 1,200 on this type. So overall, this was a very experienced crew with a lot of flight time under their belts, something that would come to play a big part in the outcome of this story. Anyway, while the passengers boarded and the flight crew were running through the pre-flight checks, down on the ground, United Airlines ramp agents were busy loading baggage into the 747's forward cargo hold. Now, the 747 has 2 lower cargo holds, one in the front and one in the rear, each of which is accessed via an electrically powered outward opening cargo door. And one of those doors will come to play a central role in what's about to happen, so let's dive into how they worked. Because the 747's cargo holds are pressurized like the passenger cabin, these doors need to be able to withstand an intense pressure differential between the inside and the outside. The passenger doors are a type known as plug-type doors, which means that they are slightly larger than their frame, so pressurization forces then pushes them tightly closed, making them inherently safe. But to design a cargo door in this way had been shown to be pretty impractical. One way to do it would have been to have the door open inward, like on the Boeing 737 that I fly, but because the 747 doors are so large, too much cargo space would then have to be kept empty to make room for the door to travel through it, so that design had been ruled out. Alternatively, designers could make an outward opening cargo door behave like a plug door once it was closed. The Lockheed 1011 TriStar, designed in the same era as the 747, used this kind of a principle. After the door reached the closed position, a latch actuator moved it vertically downward, aligning pressure stops and ditch stops on the door with pressure stop pads around the door, which then transferred pressure loads to the fuselage and, in Lockheed's own description, created a full plug effect. But that solution is more expensive and difficult to design, so most cargo doors are instead simple, outward opening, non-plug types, which resist pressurization loads using a latching mechanism designed to prevent the door from opening in flight. And pay attention now, because this will become a little bit technical. On the Boeing 747, the cargo doors are hinged at the top with latches at the bottom, consisting of 8 horizontal latch pins attached to the door sill and 8 corresponding latch cams attached to the door itself. As the door closes, those C-shaped latch cams then clasp the latch pins and rotate clockwise to secure the door and complete the latching process. There are also 2 mid-span latches halfway up on each side of the door, but these are just meant to keep the door flush with the fuselage, not to bear much load, since the pressurization loads are almost entirely absorbed by those 8 primary latches. Now, in order to operate the door, a ramp agent can press and hold the door closed switch on the outside of the fuselage next to the cargo door. And that sends an electrical signal first to a main actuator that moves the door from the open position nearly to the closed position. And then, at that point, electrical power is automatically transferred to a pull-in hook actuator that operates hooks to draw the door in flush with the fuselage until the latch cams can then clasp the latch pins. At that point, power then automatically transfers to a third and final actuator, the latch actuator, which rotates the latch cams. When those have reached the finally latch position, power is then cut to the latch actuator, signaling to the ramp agent that it's now time to secure the door using the manual locking handle. When that handle is then pushed flush with the door, a series of torque tubes transfer that force to rotate 8 L-shaped lock sectors across the open mouths of the 8 latch cams. And now, in theory, the purpose of those lock sectors is to prevent the cams from rotating back towards the unlatched position, ensuring that the door can't unlatch in flight. And when the lock sectors enter the fully locked position, the S2 master lock switch makes contact, which results in the removal of all electrical power from the door open and close switches. Now, there had been issues with these types of doors before, not only on the Boeing 747, which I'll get back to in a second, but when we're on the topic of dangerous issues, did you know that most identity thefts start by someone just spending a few bucks on buying detailed personal profiles from a data broker online? Those sites are incredibly still legal, and they sell everything from leaked card details, social security numbers and home addresses, all without your consent. But the good thing is that you can now start fighting back, and today's sponsor, Incogni, is specifically designed to help you claim back your digital footprint and protect your online privacy. When you sign up, you will share the info you want taken down, and Incogni will then go to work scanning the internet for that data. When they find it, they will contact the site on your behalf and demand that that data is taken down. Yeah, I guess you could do that yourself, but it would likely take you hundreds of hours to do, and Incogni will also continue to monitor for compliance and keep taking your info down wherever it pops up. This means that your online footprint will slowly start to fade away without you having to lift a finger, and you will also get weekly reports about their progress, and as you can see here, they've been quite busy with me. With their family and friends plan, you can then also cover more people with the same subscription. And if you want to get started right now and get 60% off the normal price, then scan this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot and use the code PILOT at checkout. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's get back to those cargo doors, who seem to have some quite ingenious locking mechanisms keeping them safe. Moving the lock handle also closes the two pressure relief doors built into the cargo door, and those are designed to release air and prevent the airplane from pressurizing if the door isn't properly locked. And closing them will also indicate to the ramp agent that the door has been locked correctly. Plus, they activate an electric switch that extinguishes the cargo door open light in the flight engineer's station up in the cockpit. But this quite complicated sequence wasn't the only way to open or close these cargo doors. You see, Boeing had also built in a backup system to make sure that the door could still be opened and closed without access to electrical power, or if there would be a problem with one of the electrical actuators. To open the door manually, a ramp agent would first open the lock handle like normal, then use a socket driver inserted into each of the 3 manual drive ports to manually drive the latch actuator, the pull-in hook actuator, and then the main actuator all the way open. Now that was a quite labor-intensive process. In fact, driving open the latch actuator alone required 95 turns of the socket drive, and that's worth keeping in mind. Unfortunately though, much like the contemporaneous DC-10, the 747's cargo doors had a lot of problems, practically from the very beginning. And to understand why, we need to go back to 1969 when the doors were first designed and certified. At that time, just like today, any outward opening door was required to have a positive locking mechanism that would prevent the door from opening due to pressurization loads. And to comply with this, Boeing had specifically demonstrated that its lock design was sufficient to prevent the latch cams from vibrating towards the unlatched position. But Boeing presented the lock system as primarily an indication system, showing that the door was properly locked to the pilots and ramp personnel, since the latches themselves were strong enough to resist the pressurization loads. And as a result of that, Boeing's analysis of the system was based on the assumption that the lock handle couldn't be moved into the locked position if the door was unlatched, due to the interference between the lock sectors and the latch cams. But they didn't analyze whether the latch cams could be manually or electrically driven back into the unlatched position after the door had been locked, or what would happen if someone tried to do that. Now, to be clear, once the door is locked, power is cut to the electrical door opening switch, so it wouldn't be possible for a ramp agent to electrically open the door at that point, unless the S2 master latch lock switch incorrectly sensed that the door was unlocked. And if that would happen, it would be a latent failure, since there was no obvious indication to anyone if that switch had failed. So in reality, that might have been possible to do on some aircraft without anyone really realizing it. And if the latch actuator was used to drive the cams open while the door was locked, well then the steel latch cams would just bend the much weaker aluminium lock sectors out of the way, unlatching the door, since Boeing had never intended for them to actually stop the door from unlatching. And worse, even with no failure in the system at all, the same would happen if a ramp agent tried to unlatch the door manually using the socket drive while it was still locked. There was basically no safeguard against that. Let's fast forward to 1974, specifically March the 3rd, 1974, the day of the devastating Turkish Airlines DC-10 crash near Paris, which I've previously covered here on the channel. The investigation into that accident found that it was relatively easy for ramp agents to force the lock handle on the DC-10's outward opening cargo door into the locked position, regardless of whether the door was properly latched or not. And in that particular case, the door had also been so badly misrigged that the force required to do this was pretty minimal. As a result, a ramp agent locked the door while it was still not fully latched, and the door subsequently burst open as pressurization loads increased after takeoff, leading to the collapse of the floor of the passenger cabin, which severed the control cables for the DC-10's elevators. And unfortunately, the resulting loss of control and crash killed all 346 people on board. After that accident, the design of outward opening cargo doors came under industry-wide scrutiny, and changes were made to several aircraft in order to ensure that the door locking systems provided a more positive indication of whether the door was actually latched. During that process, Boeing discovered that the pressure relief doors on the 747 could indeed be driven closed as the aircraft pressurized, even if the door was not locked or latched properly, which in turn could lead to the door opening in flight. Boeing therefore immediately issued a service bulletin requiring the installation of shrouds on the pressure relief doors to prevent this, although records suggested that United Airlines had never incorporated this modification. But even during this period of increased scrutiny, Boeing never went back and re-examined whether the locking system ought to be physically restraining the door from being unlatched manually or electrically, which, in the National Transportation Safety Board's opinion after this accident, was a huge missed opportunity. And as it turns out, it wasn't the only one. In fact, another one had presented itself on the 10th of March 1987. On that day, a Pan Am Boeing 747 was climbing out of London, bound for New York, when at around 20,000 feet, the pilots noticed that the plane wasn't pressurizing correctly. So they descended back to 15,000 feet where the problem went away, and they started climbing up again, only for the same problem to reoccur. Based on that, the crew then decided to return to London and eventually landed safely, after which it was discovered that the forward cargo door was open by about 4 centimeters. The latch cams were found in the unlatched position, but the lock handle was in the locked position. The lock sectors were severely damaged, and the door warning light in the cockpit had extinguished. So, how was that possible? Well, first, investigators from Boeing and Pan Am discovered that the electric door actuators were inoperative and had been deferred for later maintenance, which had required the ramp agents to open and close the doors manually using the socket drive. So one possibility was that the pre-existing damage to the lock sectors had allowed the lock handle to be placed into the locked position while the door was still unlatched. But that was later disproven by testing. In fact, even when severely damaged, the lock sectors would interfere with the open latch cams, preventing the door from locking unless the cams were more than 80% of the way towards the latch position, in which case it would have been impossible for the door to open anyway. So instead, Boeing and Pan Am suspected that the damage was not pre-existing, but actually occurred because the ramp agent to close the door had subsequently used the socket driver to back drive the latch cams open after the door had been locked, deforming the lock sectors out of the way. But the ramp agent apparently never admitted to doing this, and no one had seen something like that happening, which is worth remembering here. In any case, after this incident, Boeing realized that the lock sectors were too weak to restrain the latch cams, so they issued a service bulletin recommending that operators should replace the aluminium lock sectors with a new steel version. 16 months later, in late 1988, the Federal Aviation Administration also issued an airworthiness directive, making this change mandatory, but airlines were also given 18 to 24 months to comply with this, depending on which 747 variant they were operating. Later, the National Transportation Safety Board harshly criticized the FAA for taking too long to act on this serious safety issue. Under federal regulations, the in-flight opening of a cargo door was classified as an unacceptable event, potentially leading to catastrophic damage, and Boeing's recommendation was issued in the form of an alert service bulletin, which is the most urgent class of service bulletins there is, used to address serious safety or flight concerns. So, not only was that 16-month wait for an airworthiness directive found to be unreasonable, there was also no good reason to give operators up to 2 years to implement this fix. Now, usually the FAA would give those types of long grace periods if part acquisition was an issue. But that wasn't the case here, since most airlines could quickly manufacture the steel lock sectors themselves in-house by cutting them out of basic sheet metal. The cost of the fix was also only about $3,000, although the plane had to be out of service for 15 hours with a significant number of man-hours of labor, so United Airlines decided to implement this modification when each airplane went in for heavy maintenance and therefore had to be grounded anyway. And in the case of November 4713 Uniform, the aircraft in this story, the next heavy maintenance session was scheduled for April of 1989, so it still had the old aluminium lock sectors installed. According to the Seattle Times, TWA and Pan Am had already replaced all of the lock sectors on their 747 fleets by February of 1989, but United Airlines had only fixed 6 out of their 31 jumbos, which, as it turns out, wasn't the only way that United Airlines fell short in this case. The Airworthiness Directive also stated that the doors should be inspected every time it had been opened or closed manually, but United Airlines accidentally left that detail out of its maintenance manual due to a clerical error, so no such inspections were being performed. And that finally brings us back to Flight 811 on the 24th of February 1989, where something unthinkable were now about to happen. Now, before I tell you the next part of the story, I have to explain that what happened at this point was initially quite controversial. And that was because the cargo door from this flight wouldn't be found until after the NTSB had already determined the probable cause of the accident. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to summarize what the NTSB initially thought had happened, which actually turned out to be wrong for reasons that I'll get into later. And in order to understand this, I also need to mention that the door ended up coming open in flight. So sorry for this spoiler, but you still want to stay on for what actually happened when that occurred, because it is one of the wildest stories that I've ever seen. But what happened initially after this accident was that without being able to examine the door itself, the NTSB had to try and infer its condition based on context clues that narrowed down the number of ways that it could have opened. If the door had been properly latched and locked when Flight 811 departed, then for the door to have opened itself, 4 failures would have to occur. First, the actuators are run off the ground handling electrical bus, which can only receive power from the auxiliary power unit or APU, normally used on the ground. It can't be powered by any of the engine-driven generators. When any engine is turned on, the ground handling bus is automatically disconnected from power, unless the pilots override it using the APU field switch with the APU running, but there was no evidence that the pilots had done that. And even if they did, the ground handling bus would still be automatically disconnected from power when the air-ground relay sensed that the aircraft was airborne, so that sensor would then also have had to fail. At that point, the latch actuator would still not receive electrical power from the ground handling bus unless the S2 master latch lock switch was also erroneously sensing that the door was unlocked. And then, on top of all of that, a short circuit would have had to occur in such a way as to erroneously operate the latch actuator into the door open direction. Now, because the S2 switch and the latch actuator and its wiring was still attached to the door, the NTSB couldn't initially verify their condition. But even so, they believed that this crazy sequence of events was highly improbable. But the number of failures would be a little bit reduced if the door had unlocked while the plane was still on the ground prior to engine start, with the APU still powering the ground handling bus. Now, assuming that the ramp agents had closed and locked the door correctly, then out of all of the failures that I just listed, only the short circuit and the failed S2 switch would be required in order to cause the door to open itself. But it was impossible for the NTSB to prove or disprove this possibility without having access to the actual door, so during the investigation it was left as an unknown. Instead, the NTSB focused on the possibility that the door was not properly latched and locked by the ramp personnel. Based on Boeing's findings in the 1987 Pan Am incident, investigators knew that very severe pre-existing damage to the lock sectors could theoretically allow the lock handle to stow when the door was not fully latched. And the NTSB felt that there was significant circumstantial evidence to suggest that the lock sectors on November 4713 uniform had pre-existing damage. The maintenance logs for that aircraft showed numerous problems with the electric door actuators stretching back months, if not even years, necessitating repeated use of the manual backup system. And if ramp personnel occasionally forgot to unlock the door before attempting to unlatch it manually, repeated damage to the lock sectors could have occurred, up to and including complete breakage of the lock sectors. And this damage might then have gone unnoticed since United Airlines wasn't performing those required inspections I mentioned before. Now, once that damage reached a certain severity, it might have become possible to lock the door without latching it. And furthermore, excessive wear on the latch pins and pull-in hooks, which were still accessible to the NTSB, suggested that the door had been misaligned for quite a while, which could have been the cause of the difficulties noted in the maintenance tech log. And if the latch actuator was having a hard time latching the misaligned door due to excessive friction interference between the latch cams and the latch pins, it could have stopped operating before the door was fully latched. So, if this was the case on the accident aircraft, to the ramp agent, when the latch actuator stopped, it would have looked like the door was properly closed and latched, prompting him to close the lock handle, at which point the damaged lock sector would have slid in place past the open latch cams, the pressure relief doors would then have closed, and the cockpit warning light would have extinguished, setting the trap. Now, it would still have been possible to see that the latch cams were still unlatched through 8 small viewing ports at the bottom of the door, but Boeing had eliminated any requirement to use those viewing ports back in 1970 when they nominated the pressure relief doors as the primary indicator of the door's status. So for the NTSB, it really looked like the pieces were now all starting to fall into place. But were they? You see, not everyone was happy with this explanation, and that was in large part because it relied on the assumption that mechanics or ramp agents were sometimes damaging the lock sectors by trying to manually unlatch the doors without unlocking them first. Something that no one had ever admitted to having done and no one had ever seen. On top of this, unlatching the door required 95 turns of the socket driver, which is a long time to go without anyone noticing or pointing out that the door was still locked. So it seems kind of improbable that there would be no direct evidence of such a remarkable error having ever actually happened. But except for that vexing point, the NTSB's initial explanation did make sense. So in 1990, the NTSB determined that pre-existing damage had allowed a ramp agent to lock a door that was improperly latched, permitting the door to later come open in flight. But in October of 1990, the door was miraculously found on the sea floor at a crushing depth of over 4,300 meters. And when it was recovered and brought to the surface, NTSB investigators immediately saw that there was no pre-existing damage to the lock sectors. In fact, they were essentially intact, although jammed against the fully open latch cams. This meant that the latch cams had been in the latch position, only to rotate back in the unlatched direction after the door had been locked, pushing the lock sectors out of the way. And that meant that the door must have been properly latched and locked before departure, only for it to be driven open again later. So the only remaining option now was that the door had somehow opened by itself. And just a few months later, in June of 1991, that was exactly what happened on board another United Airlines Boeing 747 that was being serviced at JFK Airport in New York. United mechanics were troubleshooting a rear cargo door that wouldn't open electrically since the circuit breaker that controlled power to the door kept popping out. So, as that plane sat at the gate waiting for its passengers to board, the mechanics cranked open the door manually, then reset the circuit breaker before successfully cycling the door electrically several times. They then started examining the door wiring to search for defects, and while they were doing that, the door suddenly unlatched itself and started to open, completely alone, and it could then not be stopped until someone pulled the circuit breaker. The mechanics subsequently found that several wires supplying the door actuators had been damaged at a point where the wire bundle crosses down from the fuselage into the interior face of the door, a spot where the wires would have had to flex every time the door was opened and closed. Insulation in that area had been breached and conductors were exposed, leading to a short circuit that caused the door to open uncommanded. So, with this incident and the recovery of the cargo door, the NTSB decided that they had sufficient evidence to reopen the investigation. And what I will now tell you is what they believe actually happened on board Flight 811. As the aircraft sat at the gate, the ramp agent correctly closed and locked the forward cargo door, and the 747 then waited a bit longer before being pushed back and started its engines. During this time, with power available to the ground handling bus, a short circuit most likely sent an erroneous door open command to the actuating system. The wiring that was recovered with the door showed evidence of pre-existing damage similar to that found on its sister aircraft at JFK, including on wires that were among the possible combinations whose short-circuiting could lead to an uncommanded door opening. Now, the exact wires were never identified, but not all of the wiring was found, and tests by Boeing showed that a short between these wires wouldn't necessarily leave any visible evidence anyway. Investigators also found that the S2 switch may have had pre-existing damage that could have caused it to falsely read that the door was unlocked. Now, because of this combination of failures, the forward cargo door started unlatching, but the latch cams never quite reached the fully unlatched position, either because the short-circuiting wires stopped making contact or because friction between the cams and the lock sectors exceeded the torque limit of the actuator, causing it to slip. And as a result, the door didn't open like the 1987 Pan Am incident. Instead, it just sat there nearly unlatched, held closed by the friction between the cams, pins and lock sectors. And because the door warning light was operated by the pressure relief doors, which were fully closed, the pilots had no way of knowing that anything was wrong. So this meant that they just finished the pre-flight checks, started up their engines and taxied out to the runway where, at time 0133 local, they lifted their majestic 747 off the runway and climbed into the balmy tropical night. And from that point, the clock had basically started ticking down towards disaster. Now, because the door and the pressure relief vents were still closed, the cargo hold pressurized normally as the airplane climbed, still giving no indication of any problems. Up above it, in the cockpit, the pilots now navigated around thunderstorms, which, remember, led the captain to leave the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated. And as the aircraft climbed from 22 towards 23,000 feet, the pressure differential between the cargo area and the outside air increased beyond what the mostly unlatched door could resist. At that point, some passengers heard a brief grinding noise, followed by a loud thunk sound as the latch cams finally disconnected from the latch pins, which took around 1.5 seconds, just long enough for the captain to ask, "What the hell was that?" Now, at this point, the door was held in place by the two pull-in hooks, but those were never meant to be load-bearing, which meant that they now failed almost immediately. And when they broke, the escaping pressure propelled the door open with such a force that it swung up beyond its normal maximum travel and slammed hard into the side of the passenger cabin directly above it. Simultaneously, the differential pressure between the now depressurized cargo hold and the pressurized cabin above it generated huge stresses on the cabin floor, which soon started to collapse downwards. That and the impact of the door against the cabin then caused the fuselage skin in this area to fail, and in a fraction of a second it tore upwards from the top of the cargo door, cutout, across the main passenger cabin and into the 747's upper deck as far as to the window line, ripping away an incredible 18 square meters of fuselage like the peel of a banana. This failure also took with it a large chunk of the floor beneath the right side of the business class cabin, ejecting 5 pairs of right block double seats from row 8 back to row 12, along with their 8 unfortunate occupants. Although seat 9F, which was adjacent to the breach, remained attached, the person sitting in this seat was also thrown out through the hole, either because they weren't wearing their seatbelt or hadn't fastened it tightly enough. So in total, 9 passengers were now pushed out of the plane, along with their seats, the floor, the cargo door, a large section of the fuselage skin, numerous structural ribs and stringers, and a cargo container, all of which now flew back into the slipstream, where some collided with the right wing and tail. At least one passenger was sucked into engine number 3, and debris was also ingested by engine number 4, causing severe damage to each one of them, whilst various objects glanced off the wing leading edge, inflicting dents and tears along its length. Some small debris then also bounced off the right horizontal stabilizer and the vertical tail, denting both, and a piece of cargo container lodged itself between the number 3 engine pylon and the wing underside, severing the pneumatic duct that supplied pressure to operate the 747's outboard leading edge flaps. Now, all of this happened in the space of only a second. One passenger later said, "It all happened so fast that no one actually saw it." A moment before, there had been 355 people on board, and in the blink of an eye, suddenly there were 9 less, and a gaping hole had opened up where they had once been. In the cockpit, the pilots now heard the unbelievable sound of their airplane ripping apart, and this was then followed by a surreal fog, as the sudden pressure drop caused the water vapor in the cockpit to suddenly condense. Like I mentioned in the beginning, for a few seconds the pilots thought that the plane had exploded in mid-air and that they were now falling down towards the sea, but it quickly became clear that this wasn't the case. The main power supply had been temporarily interrupted, creating a gap in the cockpit voice recording, but the electricity returned after 21 seconds, by which time the pilots were already working to diagnose the emergency. At that time, the first officer was telling Honolulu Center that they had lost engine number 3 and that they were descending rapidly, while the captain urged the flight engineer to call the cabin crew and inform them that they were in an emergency descent down to 10,000 feet, all in accordance with the procedure for a rapid decompression. The 3 pilots then tried to don their oxygen masks, but to their surprise, none of the 3 masks worked, since the damage in the cargo area had severed the supply line from the crew oxygen bottle to their masks. Outside the windows, they could at the same time see flames shooting out from the badly damaged number 3 and number 4 engines, which were now also vibrating heavily. But perhaps the most terrifying of all, some flight attendants recalled that when they saw that huge hole in the fuselage extending up and out of sight, they thought that the entire upper deck had blown off, possibly taking the pilots with it. And that fear was then worsened by their inability to reach the cockpit via the intercom, together with the sudden steep descent. Now, of course, that descent was actually intentional in order to reach an altitude where the air was more easily breathable, but the cabin crew obviously had no idea about that, since they hadn't heard the flight engineer's announcement. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain steered the plane through a tight 180-degree turn back towards Honolulu, whilst also continuing to avoid the thunderstorms, eventually putting them on course towards the airport. The crew then worked together to try and analyze the condition of engine number 3, and soon determined that it wasn't producing any thrust anymore, so they just shut it down. They also quickly started dumping fuel, since they were far above their maximum landing weight, which could lead to significant damage on landing. And at this point, the pilots hadn't yet observed the loss of thrust from engine number 4, but the captain could certainly feel it. With the 2 damaged engines on the same side, he had to push his rudder pedal fully to the left just to maintain control of their heading. This eventually caused him to look down on his engine gauges again, and at that point he saw that engine number 4 was also losing power, which the flight engineer quickly confirmed. And the 747 is not designed to be able to maintain altitude with 2 failed engines and a full load of passengers and fuel. So that now presented a huge problem. If they tried to level out, they would quickly start losing speed. And with reduced airflow over the rudder that would come with that, the captain could lose control of the airplane. So his only choice was now to try to maintain his airspeed by continuously descending, but it was unclear if they would be able to reach Honolulu before running out of altitude. Now, the fuel dumping was helping by reducing their weight, but the 747 could only dump about 5,000 pounds per minute, and they were 150,000 pounds too heavy to maintain altitude, so this wasn't exactly a silver bullet. And that meant that with about 60 miles still to go until Honolulu, a complex math problem presented itself. And if the numbers didn't work out, well then, they would have to ditch their badly damaged 747 in the open ocean at night. Now, in order to improve their situational awareness, the flight engineer offered to go down to the cabin and find out more about the nature and extent of the damage, which the captain agreed sounded like a good idea. At this point, the pilots had no idea what had taken place, and the first officer speculated that they might have lost a door, while the flight engineer thought that they might have blown a compressor blade in engine number 3. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were soon about to learn. As the flight engineer stepped out of the cockpit into the upper deck, he was shocked to see that the fuselage skin along the right side was missing up to the window line, with the night sky now clearly visible through the web of structural beams, just inches from the first-class seats and their terrified occupants. He then turned around and hurried down the spiral staircase, and when he got to the bottom, his heart must have practically stopped. Just beyond the bottom of the stairs was an immense hall, big enough to drive a car through, with several rows of seats missing and others hanging precariously over the void. Back in the cockpit, the captain and the first officer now saw the flames coming from engine number 4, but decided not to shut it down in case it was still producing a little bit of thrust, which might extend the range just a little bit further. And that is exactly the kind of prioritization and thinking outside of the box that comes with long experience, communication and great teamwork. Now they were still discussing the number 4 engine when the flight engineer burst back into the cockpit and breathlessly exclaimed, "The right side is gone from the one right back. It's just open. You're just looking outside." To which he also quickly added, "It looks like a bomb." The captain immediately reported to Honolulu Center that a bomb appeared to have exploded on board his airplane, whilst the first officer hesitantly asked whether they had lost any passengers. And to that, the flight engineer just said, "Some people are probably gone. I don't know." The next several minutes were a frantic flurry of activity as the pilots worked with air traffic control to line up for an approach to Honolulu International Airport, whilst also trying to convey the seriousness of the emergency, request ambulances and so on. They also discussed what speed to use for the approach, and the flight engineer advised not to go above 250 knots due to the risk of further structural damage, whilst the first officer advised not to go below 240 knots initially due to the risk of losing directional control with those 2 failed engines on the same side. Now this meant that the captain now had to put every bit of his skill into maintaining that narrow airspeed window, whilst the first officer and the air traffic controller coordinated to get them lined up for runway 08 left. And as they descended out of 4,000 feet, they were finally handed over to Honolulu Tower. By this point, they were still 28 nautical miles away and still drifting down slowly, with the pilots still worried that they might not make it. But the flight engineer had run the numbers and thankfully informed them that at their current descent rate, they had enough altitude to reach the runway. Soon afterwards, the lights of Oahu appeared in the distance and the pilots began setting up for the landing. The captain decided to delay extending the landing gear until just before touchdown so that the extra drag wouldn't cause them to sink below the glide path and miss the runway, but otherwise they were able to complete the 2-engine approach checklist, and the first officer calculated a final landing speed of 160 knots. Throughout the approach, the pilots then continuously checked in on each other and all critical systems, displaying excellent crew resource management as they worked to keep their crippled aircraft stable and on course. But they were unable to calculate their landing performance since the flight engineer's performance tables had been sucked out of the cockpit. And then, yet another complication emerged as they tried to extend the flaps. Because while the inboard flaps extended to 5 degrees when commanded, the outboard leading edge flaps only extended on the left side due to that pneumatic duct that had been severed by flying debris. So the first officer now very astutely pointed out that the stall warning only took into account the inboard flap position, so it wouldn't account for the relatively lower lift from the asymmetric outboard flaps. A crucial piece of info, and yet another great example of system knowledge by this crew. And if you're a pilot out there, exactly this is why studying your technical manuals are so important. Now, as a result of this, the captain decided to limit flap extension to 10 degrees in order to minimize that asymmetry, but that would then also increase their landing speed to 190 knots or 30 to 45 knots above normal, and at that speed, no one could say if the runway would be long enough. Putting that out of his mind, the captain focused on getting onto the glide path, because due to their higher speed, they were actually now going too high, and of course if they overshot the runway, they wouldn't be able to go around. Fortunately though, he was able to pull back the power a little bit and catch the glide slope from above, soon lining it up perfectly with the runway in front of them. And as planned, the first officer then extended the landing gear on short final after checking that the hydraulic systems all worked. And that showed that they actually did which assured them that they would be able to apply maximum braking, although they would only have about half of the normal reverse thrust available due to those damaged engines. Now, the first officer continuously called out their speeds and position on glide slope all the way down to the threshold, and at time 02:10, about 24 minutes after the explosion, Flight 811 touched down like butter on runway 08 left at a speed of just over 190 knots. The pilots now applied the brakes and thrust reversers as much as they could, and despite the structural damage, high speed and high landing weight, the airplane miraculously held together and came to a full stop before the end of the runway. The cabin crew immediately initiated an evacuation, and all 346 surviving passengers and crew soon exited down the escape slides into the waiting arms of the firefighters and paramedics outside. But sadly, even after an extensive search by the US Coast Guard, none of the passengers who had been ejected could be found, so all 9 were ultimately listed as missing, presumed dead. A further 38 people were also injured, including all 15 flight attendants, but it is almost certain that this death toll would have been much higher if not for the captain's fortunate decision to keep the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated for a little bit longer than usual. After the accident, the FAA issued a new emergency airworthiness directive, mandating that airlines immediately install the new steel locking sectors and reintroducing the procedure to verify the position of the latch cams using the viewing windows. The FAA also reviewed the designs of other cargo doors to identify design vulnerabilities and potential sources of human error, and they introduced new training for FAA certification personnel on human factors in aircraft design, although in the end, it turned out that no human factors were actually involved in this accident. Later, another airworthiness directive mandated the installation of a redundant switch on all 747s that would sense the position of the latches and illuminate the door warning light if the door was unlatched, even if it was locked. The NTSB also issued several other recommendations relating to cabin safety, which led to improvements in life vest design, cabin crew oxygen systems and overhead bins. But even after the NTSB revised its report to conclude that a short circuit most likely caused the cargo door to open, one thing that was still absent from the response was any new safety initiatives related to the wiring. In fact, United Airlines Flight 811 was just one of several accidents during the late 1980s and 90s that was attributed to poorly maintained or damaged wiring on older aircraft. And unfortunately, it was only after further tragedies like TWA Flight 800 and Swissair Flight 111 that new methods for maintaining wiring were finally introduced. Now, this is one of those accidents that makes the hair on my arm stand up, not just because of the horrible circumstances involved, but also by the sheer professionalism and bravery shown by the crew. This very much reminds me of the accident of Qantas Flight 32 that I covered very early on in this series. Let me know if you want an updated variant of that one, because I think that I might be able to get my friend Captain Richard to make a cameo there if I ask nicely. Anyway, if you like the work that my team and I do, then consider checking out my sponsors or join our Patreon crew. It really helps paying the salaries of this lovely gang of professionals. And if you want to do that, just scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.